Today's hearing will examine whether a number of new state voting laws imperil the right to vote. This year, we've watched young people in places like Egypt and Tunisia take to the streets to fight for what we in America often take for granted, the right to elect our leaders. In our country, regardless of how big the disagreement, how intense the debate, we settle our political differences at the ballot box. We have enshrined the right to vote as one of the major rights that every American citizen qualified has. But over the course of history, we know that that right has often been honored in the breach. Only in the last century did Americans win the right to directly elect their United States senators. And for more than half of the life of our republic, a majority of the adult population, the women of America, were not allowed to vote. Even after the franchise was legally expanded for close to a century, a well-organized, violent, often racist campaign successfully prevented many African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Fortunately, our country, over time, corrected and learned from these mistakes. In fact, our Constitution has been amended more to expand and protect the right to vote than for any other issue. 6 constitutional amendments, the 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th, ratified over the course of 100 years, underscore our nation's commitment to ensure that all adult citizens enjoy free and full access to the ballot. Courageous Americans fought for these constitutional amendments in order to guarantee the right to vote for all citizens, regardless of their race, sex, class, income, or state of residency. We must be constantly vigilant against threats to those hard-fought victories. That's why earlier this year I held a hearing on what I consider a threat to our democracy posed by the Supreme Court Citizens United decision and the flood of special interest cash into elections, and the need to fundamentally reform the way we finance our campaigns. Today, we're going to examine another potential threat to our democracy: recently passed state voting laws designed to restrict voting. I am deeply concerned by this coordinated, well-funded effort to pass laws that would have the impact of suppressing votes in states like Wisconsin, Texas, Florida, Indiana, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Regardless of the stated intention or goals, many analysts believe these laws will cause widespread voter suppression and disenfranchise by making it more difficult for millions of disabled, young, minority, rural, elderly, homeless, and low-income Americans to vote. Let's take a moment to consider some of the new restrictions on voting we'll discuss today. Since the beginning of this year, 7 states have passed laws requiring certain forms of photo identification prior to voting. At first blush, it might appear that ID requirements are reasonable. After all, who can't produce an ID? There's an old saying that applies here: the devil is in the details. The way these laws are written, not just any ID will do. According to numerous studies, millions of Americans who are currently eligible to vote do not have an ID that would satisfy these new restrictive laws. And these individuals are disproportionately young, low-income, senior citizens, African Americans, and Latinos. It is unclear what, if any, efforts are being made to make sure that those who do not have the required IDs will be able to obtain them before the next election. Some states have also passed laws drastically reducing the early voting period. Early voting is primarily used by our fellow citizens who cannot get to the polls on Election Day for a variety of reasons. They may not have reliable transportation. They may work at a job that does not allow them to take time off. They may have trouble finding child care. If they're disabled or elderly, they may not be able to count on receiving the assistance they need to get to the polls on Election Day. For these reasons and many others, the number of people voting early has increased with each election. In 2008, for example, 30% of all votes were cast before Election Day, which causes one to ask, why are some states reducing the early voting period when the number of early voters is clearly on the rise? Finally, there are 2 states, Florida, Senator Bill Nelson's state, and Texas, that have enacted laws that threaten to end voter registration drives by nonpartisan groups. The Florida law places onerous administrative burdens on volunteers who sign up to help their neighbors register to vote. If a volunteer fails to meet a series of administrative requirements, they could be prosecuted and fined. This law is so bad, for the first time ever, the League of Women Voters, a highly respected, nonpartisan organization, indefinitely suspended all voter registration drives in Florida. These are just 3 examples of laws that could seriously impede voting rights in America. The proponents of these new restrictive state laws argue they're all about reducing fraud. Yet, as Professor Levitt, a witness on our second panel, has demonstrated, the incidence of voter fraud in America is minimal, and the reported fraud is often anecdotal, unsubstantiated, and contrived. I'm particularly concerned that the states where these laws were passed have not taken adequate measures to ensure that affected individuals will in fact have the ability to vote. That's why today I'm sending a letter to the governors in 3 of these states, Florida, Wisconsin, and Tennessee, asking them to inform the subcommittee of their plans for ensuring that the laws they have enacted will not disenfranchise the citizens of their state. Protecting the right of every citizen to vote and ensuring our elections are fair and transparent are not Democratic or Republican values. They're American values.